party you had always supported suddenly turned against you? It's a question Arthur Koestler's protagonist asks us in his 1940 novel Darkness at Noon, and it's a question that we'll be addressing alongside many more in our exciting new series, Liza's Book Club. Hi everyone, welcome back to Pens and Poison. I'm your host Liza, and today I'm excited to introduce the first installment of a brand new series coming to Pens and Poison called Liza's Book Club. Here on Pens and Poison, we love all things literature, but we also recognize that we all run busy lives and sometimes don't always find the time to read, myself included. I'm here to remedy that by introducing the new Liza's Book Club series, where we'll commit to reading just one book a month together and analyzing it. So each month, I'll read a book with you and we'll analyze it, discuss it at the end of the month through questions that you can leave me here, over on email, or over on Instagram. By the way, if you're not following me on Instagram, you can do so right here. I have several fantastic questions from you all already that I have saved and will dive into during this video, so let's go ahead and dive in. You can also check out our companion reading guide that's up on my blog. That should have been emailed out to you guys if you're on my mailing list. If you're not on my mailing list, don't forget to sign up at lizalibes.com. And we'll also link the study guide below. So I've tried to pick books that I'm not familiar with myself so that we can have an authentic and thought-provoking discussion. By the way, there will be spoilers in these videos, so I recommend you read these books first and come back and watch once you're ready to further dive into the book's thematics. All right, so Darkness at Noon. This is a book I've been wanting to read for quite a long time now, but have never really gotten around to until now. And wow, I'm so glad I read this thing. Darkness at Noon is a book about a political dissident. His name is Nikolai Salmonovich Rubashov. He's a high-ranking member of the party who finds himself imprisoned and accused of treason. So we're not quite told what party he's a member of or even what country the book is set in, but given the author's own life and shocking parallels to the Stalinist purges of the 1930s, we can assume that the book is, if not set in, then at least heavily influenced by the Soviet Union and, of course, the Soviet Union's intense political repression. One of the big giveaways of the Soviet influence is the character number one. That's the leader of the party whose portrait hangs in virtually every room in the novel. Number one, of course, is a parallel to Joseph Stalin, much the same way that the pig Napoleon is a stand-in for Stalin in George Orwell's Animal Farm. Okay, so let's talk first a little bit about Arthur Koestler, our author. He was born in 1905 in Budapest in Hungary. He studied science, engineering, before he became a journalist, which took him across Europe and sparked his interest and involvement in politics. In the 1930s, Koestler joined the Communist Party, and he was driven by a strong belief in its ideals and the promise of a better society. But of course, his experiences in the Soviet Union and actually as a political prisoner in the Spanish Civil War, which he fought in, led him to see contrast between the party's ideology and its actions. So it's interesting actually because George Orwell, the writer who wrote a very similar critique of the Soviet Union, of course through 1984 in Animal Farm, also fought in the Spanish Civil War. He was on the side of the Reds, which is also known as the Republican side. That was the Stalinist-backed communist side. And it was the same side that Koestler fought in. So they were actually both on the communist side. And they both came out of that war with very, very deep criticisms of communism and kind of the internal struggles that they saw within the Communist Party. And Orwell actually wrote a book about his experiences in the war as well, in addition to Animal Farm and 1984. That's called Homage to Catalonia. Check it out. So Arthur Koestler, he witnessed a lot of the brutal realities of totalitarian regimes, especially during the Civil War, and that began to erode his faith in communism. And his experience of his incarceration and some of the political persecution probably influenced the writing of Darkness at Noon. And his experiences also probably in some way mirror the experiences of Rubashov, our protagonist. The novel overall is really a critique of totalitarianism and Koestler's belief in the importance of individual conscience, which we'll talk about in just a second here as well. So we can use Koestler's personal history and ideological evolution here to help us appreciate Darkness at Noon, not just as a political novel, but as a deeply personal and philosophical novel and exploration of human morality. We'll also talk a little bit about morality in just a second here, but let's first talk about structure. So the book is divided into three parts, three separate interrogations that Rubashov undergoes. The first part of the novel sets the stage for Rubashov's arrest and then initial imprisonment. So the interrogation itself doesn't occur until the very end of the section. During part 1, the interrogation takes place between Rubashev and his old comrade, Ivanov. So Ivanov represents the old guard of the party and shares a long history with Rubashev. As I was reading personally, actually, I was very surprised at some of this dialogue. So to me, it almost felt like philosophical discourse rather than an interrogation, and philosophical discourse coupled with psychological manipulation. So in this section, Ivanov tries to persuade Rubashev to confess to the charges against him, and he argues that doing so will not only be for the good of the party, but will also help him get off with a more mild sentence. Their encounter is a little bit nostalgic. There's a lot of clash of ideals here, and then both of these guys are really thinking about the revelation that they once believed in. Then we get to the second part of the book. This is the second interrogation, also between Rubashev and Ivanov, but in this section we also meet the character Glin, who talks to Ivanov and has a slightly different philosophy in terms of how they should approach Rubashev's interrogation. So Glin believes in a more kind of cold-hearted approach to interrogation and urges Ivanov to resort to physical torture. Ivanov instead visits Rubashev in his cell, and we then learn about the death of Buro, another political prisoner who's sentenced to death for disagreement regarding submarine size. So Bogorov's an old roommate of Rubashev's, and he's actually dragged in front of Rubashev's cell right after his execution. His last word is Rubashev. And this image really begins to haunt Rubashev in the second part of the book. He starts to reflect on some of the innocent lives he sacrificed for the sake of a party. He also starts to concentrate specifically on this woman named Orlova, who is an old lover of his, who he sacrificed for his own sake, basically to save his own guts. Orlova takes on, at this stage, a new vivid character in his mind. Her death is almost humanized, and Rubashev becomes very horrified by this. He starts to develop a very clear conscience and value system that was really absent earlier in his character. Ivanov, when he comes in to mock Rubashev in his cell, he does mock him for some of these sort of Christian values that he starts to develop, and then we get this idea of vivisectional morality. So what is vivisectional morality and anti-vivisectional morality? So anti-vivisectional morality, he says, is no good for the progression of history. In his optimal vivisectional morality, human experiments are justified for the greater good of the party and the state. Basically, under vivisectional morality, human beings become experiments. And Rubashev's morality is the sort of anti-vivisectional morality where human beings are treated as humans. Then we go over to a really great part in the novel, a conversation on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Rubashev tells Ivanov that the psychological downfall of Raskolnikov, the protagonist of Crime and Punishment, demonstrates exactly the sort of morality system that he comes to uphold, where human life is valuable. And then, of course, Ivanov laughs at him for embodying this sort of human-centric morality system where every human life is valuable, this sort of Christian humanitarian thinking. And Ivanov leaves with the conviction that Rubashev is going to surrender to him and give him the confession, because Rubashev, after all, is a logical person, and that's how part 2 ends. So then we get to part 3, and we begin to see a big dramatic shift in tone, and this is where things start to get really interesting. During the third interrogation, Rubashev faces a sort of different, more intense interrogation. This time, it's not with Ivanov, it's with Glin. So Glin is this new generation of the party. He's cold, he's unwavering, and he uses physical and psychological torture to kind of break through to Rubashev. During this interrogation scene, we have a lot of observations from Rubashev that are filled with these psychological ideas. Rubashev says, "We've replaced decency with logical consistency." So Rubashev's ideas underscore this sort of dehumanization of this regime, and we can see that a lot in Glin. So Glin deprives Rubashev of sleep, he holds him under this intense blinding light. He brings out actually a fellow inmate, Herlip, who accuses Rubashev of planning the assassination of number 1, who is Stalin. This is, of course, a false accusation, and it's meant to save Herlip's own life. Rubashev later recognizes Herlip as a son of an old friend of his. He also learns that his previous interrogator at this point, Ivanov, has been shot to death. The party does not really like a lot of people. And the crazy thing is that by the end of the novel, Glin actually convinced Rubashev to sign his confession. So by this point, Rubashev is physically and mentally exhausted. He really has no choice but to sign himself away to the party. And we see a really clear parallel to the Soviet Union at this point. The parallel is to the show trials of the late 1930s in the USSR, which is what inspired Koestler's writing of the novel. And Rubashev's fate starts to echo the fate of Nikolai Bukharin, who was a Bolshevik leader who Koestler admired, and of course one of Stalin's most prominent ideological rivals. Bukharin himself confessed to crimes that he hadn't committed and was sentenced to death on March 13th in 1938. Later on in the novel, we also see a journalistic overview of what happened to Rubashev and how he gives his confession, which Koestler basically took from Bukharin's confession as well. Then we get to my favorite section of the novel. This is a section that's called the grammatical fiction. So the grammatical fiction is a term that Rubashev himself conceptualizes, and it's this idea where an individual person's thoughts and beliefs are influenced by the greater party. So in this system of the grammatical fiction, the word I essentially disappears. You can kind of see a similar parallel actually in Ayn Rand's Anthem, right? Where everything is we instead of I. Same thing here, right? The grammatical fiction is the absence of the I. It's the absence of the individual. And in this grammatical fiction section, we hear Rubashev's final confession. He comes to terms with kind of the corrupt nature of the party that he once served, and he really wonders whether it's worth eliminating kind of senseless suffering if it means an increase in purposeful suffering. He actually concludes in this section that it's not worth it. So, the sort of experiment that the party is running doesn't really hold up when it's applied to mankind. And Rubashev thinks that the equation here that's prescribed by the party doesn't really seem to add up. So under the party system, the definition of the individual becomes, as he says, 1 million divided by 1 million, and denies subjective consciousness. This sort of mathematical precision, when applied to human beings, actually echoes some of the ruminations of Dostoevsky's Underground Man, right in the first section of Notes from the Underground. And Dostoevsky in this book is actually responding to this guy named Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who puts forth this idea of mathematical precision when it comes to human beings in a utopian socialist work called What Is to Be Done. The title here was actually later borrowed by Lenin in an early pamphlet that he wrote on the revolution. So within the revolutionary spirit, human beings are reduced to the sort of mathematical precision that both Rubashev and the Underground Man refute. They both think that human beings aren't works of logical calculus, and Rubashev concludes that, reason alone is a faulty compass that culminates in great darkness. Regardless of this conclusion, he still gives in and realizes that he's a powerless force against the greater party. So the grammatical fiction section does a really great job of summarizing some of the big themes that we see play out in the novel overall. The biggest theme, of course, is this idea of the individual and the collective, which is the grammatical fiction itself. So I would argue that probably the most important theme is this individual versus collective theme. It's really embodied in the idea of the grammatical fiction. So throughout the novel, Rubashev begins to realize the importance of the individual, which he definitely had no idea of at the start. And he actually pronounces the word I for the first time, right, when he's tapping out the I to his inmate on the other side of the wall, right? And he realizes that the party, which he once thought was, very infallible, is actually deeply, deeply flawed. And after his interrogations, he really has no choice but to capitulate to it, because it is a system where the individual doesn't really exist. It's all the state. So his individual conscience doesn't really matter here. But speaking of individual conscience, morality is another really big theme in this novel. We start to see Rubashev become painfully aware of this sort of old guard morality, the sort of moral conscience we see in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Right? So Ivanov believes in this vivisectional morality where all human beings are just meant to be experimented on for the welfare of the state, and Rubashev starts to believe in the value of each individual life. And he starts to appeal to this sort of Judeo-Christian moral conscience. Actually, the epigraph to the third interrogation, the third section of the novel, is a quote from the Bible. It's a quote from Matthew. And I think that really succinctly sums up the morality theme that runs throughout the third section. So the quote reads like this: "But let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil." And in this passage, actually, it's from the New Testament, right? So Jesus is explaining that yes and no should be binding words. So if you say you're going to do something, you should probably do it. But really, beyond holding true to promises, or beyond having the meaning of holding true to promises, the epigraph really highlights this kind of duplicitous nature of the political discourse within the totalitarian regime. So Rubashev has this moral complexity and also a sort of ethical decay, right? So it's unclear where the moral boundaries are for the party, and the party system is sort of an erosion of the concepts of good and evil, right? The very clear ideas of good and evil that we find in Judeo-Christian morality, right? These ideas of good and evil have been present in the Western morality system for thousands of years. The party attempts to do away with that, and really without a good understanding of what good and evil is, and perhaps, with a deliberate scorning of these concepts, the party can really do whatever it sees fit and undertake whatever malicious actions it sees fit. And then we get, of course, the biggest malicious action here is Rubashev's psychological manipulation. So the dynamic between Rubashev and Ivanov and Gletkin is really central to understanding the novel. So Ivanov is an old friend of Rubashev's. He kind of represents the old guard of the revolution. Gletkin is the new, this ruthless force in the revolution, someone who has never seen the world pre-revolution, right? And Ivanov likes this kind of psychological manipulation, but Gletkin likes more of this physical and torture and relentless pressure. And you see this contrast within the shifting methods of the party. They definitely start to increasingly dehumanize people, right? And both methods actually ultimately leave Rubashev feeling helpless and ready to give in, right? So I think at the end of the day, Rubashev gives in because he is unable to see this clear moral compass, right? He's unable to just say yay, yay, or nay, nay. He gives in because he realizes that that sort of morality system is futile in the face of the party. All right, well, let's dive into some questions that you guys may have about this book. By the way, if you'd like your questions answered on our next installment of Liza's Book Club, make sure to send those in. Send me your questions over on email. My email is going to be liza@pensandpoison.com. I'll link it in the description below. You can DM me over on Instagram as well, over on Pens and Poison on Instagram, or leave them in the comment section. So let's go ahead. First, here's a question from a listener named Stacy. Why doesn't the author ever identify the USSR in the book? Great question. So I would venture to say that part of the reason here is that Koestler's point is that it actually doesn't really matter what country this sort of regime is taking place in. The main idea is that the totalitarian ideas really could arise anywhere, so it doesn't matter if it's the Soviet Union or, Mao's China, this really could happen anywhere. All right, next question from Rhea. Hi Liza, I enjoy your work. Can you clear up the idea of vivisectional morality and anti-vivisectional morality? I was very confused here. Thank you. Okay, good. So we talked about this a little bit. Let's go a little bit more in depth into vivisectional morality. So the word vivisection means the practice of performing operations on live animals for the purpose of experimentation or scientific research. So scientific research, that's going to be a big central question of the novel. So one of the ideas is that under the party's morality system, or I guess you could say the lack of morality system, human beings are meant to be experimented on for the greater good of the state, right? And at one point, once again, Ivanov tells Rubashev that the goal of the state is kind of to eliminate this senseless suffering, and Rubashev sort of starts to realize that, well, actually, you can't eliminate senseless suffering without inflicting purposeful suffering, right? And it's not worth it to increase purposeful suffering to eliminate senseless suffering. So the idea here is really that human beings are not meant to be experimented on. So vivisectional morality is the morality that allows human history to be a sort of experiment. And, that's what Rubashev concludes, that human beings are not a mathematical experiment. So the vivisectional morality at the end of the day actually causes more suffering than good. All right, let's do one more question from you awesome and amazing people. Oh, okay, let's do this one. This one's actually really good. Okay, so Jonas says, hi Liza, you mentioned somewhere else that your parents are from the Soviet Union. Do you think that Darkness at Noon is an accurate representation of some of the injustices going on in the Soviet Union based on what you know about it? Great question. Okay, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is, so my parents, of course, were not around for the Stalinist purges of the 1930s. My grandparents probably were. They were maybe not. They were like 5. Okay, they don't remember either. But, you know, my parents were around in the time of Brezhnev, and by then the Soviet Union, the evil started to die down a little bit. But what I will say is that the scariest thing is that my mom actually still has very, very fond memories of the Soviet Union. She has this sort of like idealistic nostalgia for it. So it's actually really crazy to think about the level of ideological brainwashing that was going on in the Soviet Union and how, you know, Soviet citizens really taught to think about repression in their country. This is really a lot of the sort of stuff that you see in Darkness at Noon, and all of the events happening in Darkness at Noon were going on behind the scenes while everyone else was just sort of kept in blissful ignorance, which is a really big theme of Darkness at Noon as well, keeping people in blissful ignorance while the evils are going on behind the stage. All right, well, that is our discussion on Darkness at Noon. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned something new today. So next month, we are going to be diving into Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, which, if you like the Soviet Union, this was a novel that was very widely read in the Soviet Union. So go ahead, make sure to hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, get notified when our next episode goes live. If you want to receive our little reading guide and all this stuff, don't forget to subscribe to my mailing list over at Libes.com. We'll be reading Sister Carrie next month, so if you have questions about Sister Carrie, you want to see me answer them over on this channel, make sure to email your questions to Liza@pensandpoison.com or leave them in the comments below. And I'd love to also hear your thoughts on Darkness at Noon in the comments. What stood out to you about Darkness at Noon, and does Rubash's journey still impact us today? Thank you guys again so much for joining me on Pens and Poison. This is Liza's Book Club. Happy reading. Hi guys, it's Liza. If you enjoy reading and analyzing Darkness at Noon with me, then don't forget that we'll be reading Sister Carrie for the month of August. So pick up your copy and I'll see you back here in August.